Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to you. My name is Anne-Marie Nunez. I work at the University of Manchester and manage the Creative Manchester Research Platform alongside our academic director, Professor John McAuliffe, who you'll be hearing from shortly. You're all very welcome this afternoon. We're really delighted to host this Framework for Collaboration workshop in conjunction with our friends at Aspect, and we're really grateful for the funding that we've received to be able to host today's event, but also to conduct this creative industries deep dive research. You're going to hear from a range of excellent speakers today, but before we start our workshop, I've got some brief housekeeping and Zoom etiquette to run through. And I know a few people are still just arriving, so we'll just run through this quickly. If I could ask you all to stay muted throughout, apart from when we do go off into breakout rooms, just so we can avoid any background noise. You're very welcome to keep cameras off at this point if you prefer to do so. If I could just ask until the breakout sessions, and then if please do be welcome to turn them back on for the discussion part. I've been asked to remind everybody that the event today is being recorded, but the breakout rooms won't be recorded, so that bit can be a free and open discussion. We're going to be using the chat function mostly today to manage any queries or questions that you might have. But we're also happy to encourage you to introduce yourselves, say your name, which organisation you're from, and if you wish to share any other details, email address, etc., then you feel free to do so. If I can ask you to set your view to speaker view, but we will be spotlighting our panel and our speakers so that each one appears clearly to you. And then finally, if you're a Twitter user, please do tweet about today's event using the handle @UOM Creative MCR, and we'll put that in the chat as well. Now, I've got the very important job today of timekeeping, and we've got a really packed 90 minutes together, and we want you to get as much as possible out of this workshop this afternoon. So I don't intend on breaking my own rules by speaking for too long. I'm really pleased to welcome our first speaker, Professor John McAuliffe, who is Director of Creative Manchester. So thank you, everybody, and I hope you enjoy the event this afternoon. Over to John.
Thanks, Anne-Marie, and hello, everybody. As Anne-Marie said, I am the Director of the University of Manchester's Creative Manchester Research Platform. The research platforms at Manchester are university-wide, and they are entirely grounded on collaborative working across the faculties and with partners external to the university, especially in our case in cultural and creative industries. And what we do is convene, develop and sustain interdisciplinary communities. In phase one of this Aspect project, we used interviews to work out how partnerships evolved and then how they developed, what barriers of language and of institutional structures our partners met, and just as importantly, what kinds of value can be added by working in partnership. And at Creative Manchester, we have subsequently leaned on the work of the Aspect deep dive to understand how best we can work together and develop a common framework. And I'm certainly looking forward to testing some of that research and to learning more about how we can work together better with partners this afternoon. I'm going to hand over now to somebody who can report on our collaborative working skills, and that's Tim at Cardiff. And I think Tim is going to speak a little bit about Cardiff. Tim Edward at the in Cardiff.
Thanks, John. That's very kind of you. Thank you to the team from Manchester Creative and also Aspect. Yep, my name's Tim Edwards. I'm the Pro Dean for Research, Impact and Innovation at Cardiff Business School, and I have the role as PI for the university team in Cardiff for Aspect. So I can see it both from the research side and also the collaborative side. And yes, John, it's been really nice to be working with your team. It's been very effective. And I'm really excited and delighted that we'll be able to develop the partnership in the coming months. Cardiff Business School and Cardiff University are committed to the supporting and championing of creative talent in Wales and within UK more broadly. And we see the opportunity that this particular Aspect project has in enabling us to develop links across the UK and to better understand in a comparative way how business engagement and collaborative relations are developed, implemented and sustained and made durable. The involvement of Cardiff is kind of slightly behind the curve. Colleagues from Manchester and York and the Humber area have already done a year's work on this, and this is what we'll be listening to today, which I'm very interested to hear more about in terms of the framework. We're kind of picking up the baton for the next 4 to 5 months, where we'll be doing a similar project to act as a further comparator with the work that's already been done by and led by Alicia here. I'm keen to see what that looks like. We have a number of initiatives in Cardiff. There's Creative Cardiff, which is a network in support of the creative industries that's been up and running for a number of years. And then recently, colleagues at Cardiff University and other institutions and other bodies in Wales have received a substantial award to set up what's called Cluster, which is a organisation that supports the screen sector in the creative industries. And I'm hoping that we'll be working with them closely as a follow-on to the work that you guys have done in Manchester. So the Cardiff crew are kind of very excited to be part of this. I'm going to pass over now back to Manchester, and the back goes to Rachel Kenyon, who's the Business Engagement Officer at the University of Manchester. Over to you, Rachel.
I am here. My laptop was just being slow to unmute me. Hello, everybody. So yeah, I've been asked just to give a brief overview of business engagement and knowledge exchange here at Manchester. I was interviewed as part of the deep dive that Alicia conducted. Obviously, different institutions are involved in aspects, but I imagine the setup is largely similar across the different institutions. So you can take what we do at Manchester as probably similar in your other universities also. So as it says on the tin, business engagement and knowledge exchange, we are here to facilitate research collaborations and knowledge exchange activity with non-academic partners. So that does include public and third sector, despite business being very much in the title of our team name. So we're here, I'd like to describe us as the front door to the university, and that works both ways. So we do have businesses, organisations contacting us, looking for academic expertise, which could be quite vague. Can you help us innovate? Something like that. It can be very specific. We've heard about such a new technology or methodology, and we'd like to learn how to use that and embed that in our organisation. It could be very specific. We have seen Professor X at a conference and we'd love to get in touch or set up a meeting, something like that. What we do is to ask the early stage questions and work out, is there a tangible potential collaboration here? Is it going to be academically interesting? Is the timescale and route to funding feasible? As any colleague from a university will know, if a business approaches us and says, we want this project and can it be delivered by the end of next month, please? The answer is almost certainly not. So we're here to be that kind of stopgap and ask those sensible questions at the outset to try and work out, is it now worth setting up a meeting involving some relevant academics here? We don't want to waste their time. And as well as dealing with those inbound inquiries and then doing that sort of highbrow Cilla Black role of matchmaking with some of our academics, if we find people with relevant expertise. We also have academic colleagues that will get in touch with us with a project idea or sometimes a fully formed project that would benefit from, or in fact requires partners. We might need access to their data, to their systems. We might want to apply research into a new sector that's been delivered somewhere else, and we might want to work with partners for that. So academic colleagues can get in touch with us and say, who do we have partnerships with in the consumer utility sector, for example, or in the finance sector? And could you make some introductions around this project? And we will do the same sort of thing. We'll set up some meetings, and we try and take that legwork from setting up collaborations from academics so that you don't have to do that. And we're here to advise on what might be a suitable mechanism for something. If it's an inbound inquiry, it might be that a simple bit of consultancy. If we find someone with the relevant academic expertise, we can set that up. You can pay for some of their time on a consultant basis. Or we would look at the breadth of something. Is this new fundamental research? Is this a longer, deep project? Do we need to be applying for a joint grant? Is this a distinct piece of work that perhaps a postdoc can be recruited on for a few months? And does the partner have the funding for that? Is this not research? Is it perhaps a knowledge transfer partnership? And if so, we have a sub-team within our team who look after knowledge exchange. So specifically, they specialize in knowledge transfer partnerships and also managing our impact acceleration accounts, which are another useful route to do early stage and exploratory work with partners that could then lead into bigger projects. And they can also fund routes to impact from existing projects that we might have done to help embed that new knowledge into partner organizations. So that's, in a nutshell, what we do as the Business Engagement Knowledge Exchange team. And as I said, what the other universities probably have a largely similar setup. Similar advice. I believe at this point I am handing over to Costas.
So I'm Alicia Riverol, and my colleague Kostas Kakavalakis is going to be co-presenting with me. We are partnered now with Cardiff on the Deep Dive Aspect project. My colleague at Creative Manchester is going to be setting up my PowerPoint right now, but in the interim, I'm going to go ahead and just give you a brief update about the first phase of the project. So I'm the research associate at Creative Manchester. I also lecture in creative writing at University of Salford, and I come from a family of creative industries participants, essentially writers, both in film and television, and so fiction, nonfiction, etc. So I have quite a vested interest in the creative industries, given my own background. And that's part of why I joined this project in December 2020. So I'm going to go ahead with our first slide. Josh, if you can advance us, please. Super. So I'm going to give you a project overview. John McAuliffe has spoken briefly about our collaboration through Aspect funding with University of York. I was teamed up with Dr. Sam Stockley-Patel. I was the research lead on the Manchester side, and our aim was an exploration of best practice in creative industries business engagement with arts, humanities, and social science research in Yorkshire, Humber, and Greater Manchester regions. We undertook, Sam and I, regional deep dives and these outputs that were specific to both Greater Manchester and the Yorkshire Humber area. We also had a collaborative output that considered broader creative industries best engagement, best practice in BE. And these were regionally informed but nationally relevant outputs. Next slide, please. So Sam and I, Sam was based at Ecrs Stories at York. We teamed up to conduct, between us, 45 interviews with 46 interviewees across the 3 regions. There were 26 academics from Leeds, York, Sheffield, Leeds Beckett, Met, Salford, and Manchester. And the academics we interviewed were partnered with organizations across the CCIs. They engaged with people in theater and performance, gaming, film and TV, museums and galleries, architecture, visual arts, publishing, and heritage. The CCI professionals that we interviewed, 20 in total, themselves worked in theater, performance and music, visual arts, film, TV, and media arts, museums and galleries, literature festivals, and community arts, also government agency and arts consultancies. Now, these were large companies and national portfolio organizations, as well as micro companies and SMEs, and you can see there the divide across the regions. Next slide, please. So our outputs included an arts, humanities, social sciences, and creative industries business engagement output or a report, and that was on both regions. The good practice for social sciences and creative industries business engagement report, and that was the more inclusive, collaborative report that we created. Again, these were based on the interviews. Good practice guide aimed at HEI business engagement staff. I've seen from the chat, there are people who work in business engagement who might be interested in some of these documents. Short interest grabber aimed at creative industries companies, social media content to disseminate the highlights from these above. And lastly, these recordings, transcripts, and related ephemera that are archived in the Creative Manchester archive. And the links to the Aspect site are available at the end of this presentation. Next slide, please. I'm going to hand us over now to Kostas for him to describe and tell you more about the Cardiff deep dive. As I've noted, York was our original collaborator, and when we moved on to this next phase, we invited Cardiff, both Tim Edwards and Kostas, to join us.
Thank you, Alicia. A few words, on the Cardiff project. So obviously, from the outset, one of the objectives is to pretty much replicate, the type of work that our colleagues in Manchester and York have already done. So at Cardiff, as Tim mentioned already, Creative Cardiff is a key stakeholder on the project, and so in collaboration with them, we have lined up around 35 participants from both the academic and creative fields. And we are about to embark on our data collection shortly. As I said in the first instance, there's a room for comparison here between what we're going to be finding out as part of the Cardiff project and the findings that have been produced by our colleagues at Manchester and York. In terms of perhaps a second step in the process, once we have actually completed our interviews, we will be looking to possibly do a little case study with either Creative Cardiff or Cluster, one of these organizations that Tim mentioned in the introduction earlier. And that will allow us to actually perhaps get a more in-depth understanding of the key issues, or perhaps view our findings in a more critical light. So again, in terms of outputs, some of the outputs produced by our findings will be particular to the Greater Cardiff area, but also we're hoping that we'll also be producing nationally relevant outputs if we, when we combine our findings with the work that has already been conducted at Manchester and York. So hopefully we'll be able to give you more of an update on that in the workshop that's going to be taking place in Cardiff in a couple of months' time. So I'll stop here and hand over back to Alicia.
Okay, great. Super. Next slide, please. So I'm going to speak briefly about the framework that we developed. I should say that when we wrapped up the aspect phase 1, we realized that we felt a call to do something with the material that we gathered beyond the reports. We wanted to make the framework accessible, basically, to a broader audience. And what we've done is created essentially, this is several phases really, establishing the partnership relationship, which is the preparatory phase, and that would be locating goals, locating motives, building a partnership. These often evolve out of professional networks, but sometimes through serendipity. It is vital that you don't let funding be the driver, though, that you locate partners first, not the other way around. Alignment of values is quite important. Identifying and discussing those underlying values of your proposed partner and mutually shared goals. Trust building is a key part of the process. Ensure you have capacity to develop that kind of working relationship, which in turn requires project development time, setting aside sufficient time for planning. For meetings, you might consider a third place outside both organizations. Partnership expectations, managing those are a key part of the preparation. Laying out expectations regarding pace, timing, delivery, outcomes, and long-term versus short-term collaboration. Liaisons, identify bridge builders in academia, or as Rachel noted earlier, BE and KE can often be a liaison for the startup of a project. With regard to budgets, key to discuss those budgetary needs openly and any concerns to ensure equitable budgets. Look for value-added opportunities at minimal cost to staff. And diversity, partner with institutions and organizations that are already invested in it, and ask yourself, is diversity located also at the top? Next slide, please. So in designing the program, you'll want to clarify and agree project aims and outputs at the start. Ensure these are mutually beneficial. Develop SMART goals to ensure project aims are attainable. Ensure adequate funding is in place, or make your requests for needed funds to support project aims and outputs. Identify your research questions, key roles. Approach BE and KE with regard to smaller pots of funding. The impact accelerator accounts that Rachel mentioned earlier can be quite useful. They're not a big time demand in terms of a grant, as related to HRC, for instance, and other relevant support that they can offer. Seek university and senior leadership buy-in. This will come in later in some of my closing comments. This is quite vital if you're hopeful to facilitate a longer-term collaboration. Strive to minimize bureaucracy. Agility within your institution as you're able is vital. Locate strategies to secure swift payments for outside institutions. This is in many ways respecting resource differences between the institutions. Aim for transparency and in leadership and planning, and strive for equality in those relationships, despite differing sizes and budgets. And remain flexible and responsive to change. But one of our interviewees recommended a memorandum of understanding if it would be needed. Strive to be respectful, inclusive, compassionate, and quite important, understanding of competing demands. Next slide, please. So in whether you're based in an HEI or a CCI, and again, a reminder, this is not a one size fits all. This is the kind of framework that has to be really flexible and adapt to your own specific context. But both HEIs and CCIs would have infrastructure support that would be vital for a strong partnership. First, the HEIs. So you'll want to request and secure adequate leave time from teaching and or marking. A number of our interviewees reflected on this. Again, approach the BE and KE team, raise smaller pots of funding, apply early for ethics as and if needed, and streamline that ethics process where possible. Strive to minimize bureaucracy. Bureaucracy came up a lot in the interviews. Locate strategies to secure swift payment for outside institutions where that's possible. Request adequate staffing as needed. Is staffing plan feasible? Time allocations realistic? Are contracts fair for staff, or are you relying too much on precarious positions? Develop a project plan, include timings that allow for academic schedules, and ensure that your partner finds these timings feasible on their side. And discuss outcomes with regard to intellectual property rights, publication, etc. Lastly, on this slide, strive for a common language. Might BE officers serve as translators for your proposal and or planned outputs. Common language is quite vital, I think, to the partnership. Next slide, please. So CCIs, again, will have their own infrastructure issues. You would want to meet with your organization and team or directors to discuss the proposed partnership. You want to request and ensure adequate time is built into your job description. Consider additional administrative or other staff support that's needed and request that staff support. Address issues regarding fair terms for freelancers. This came up a lot in the interviews with regard to COVID. Freelancers really fell through the gaps. So that's quite important to make sure that staffing is really well handled. Locate existing resources, small funding pots if available within the organization. Identify potential challenge points. What about cash flow as it pertains to the project? How will the institution handle delayed payments by the university? Now, for CCIs that are handling student placements or internships, you'll want to determine who will train and supervise placements in organization. And you would want to discuss with the HEIs or your academic colleagues how student placements will be developed. Also identify additional training needed at HEI level to ensure a swift partnership transition. Next slide, please. So in terms of executing the partnership and what constitutes markers for success, the range on that was pretty broad, actually. But the recommends and what we found in our research was that it's key to meet with the partnership team regularly where possible to reflect on project development. It's important to recognize diverse styles of learning and locate, learn, or develop common language and terminology. Identify challenges as they arise. It's key to have flexibility in your plan and schedule for both parties to have sufficient breathing room. Where difficulties have arisen, locate the opportunity to discuss and address these concerns. Strive to build skills in intercultural communication. Have you allowed time and opportunity for training in this arena? And communicate with partners if the organization's needs change or your interests have shifted, altering the project's agenda. Request and locate additional funds if grant delays have occurred or bids proved unsuccessful. Aim for outputs with accessible language and capacity to reach broader audiences. Align on both quality and standards with regard to outputs. Identify project impacts making a difference, institutional individual learning, increased legitimacy or funding. These were all pointed to as project impacts that had value. It didn't simply, for the HEIs, come down to whether papers had resulted or not, or for those working in policy, whether policies had changed. Oftentimes it was the dialogues that had begun with people at the policy level that were cited as really crucial. So locate project wins, in short. Partners often report that the built relationship itself, if featuring longevity, is itself an outcome. Next slide, please. So lastly, completing and evaluating the partnership and strategies for longevity and collaboration. Now, whether you evaluate it internally or externally, you do want to locate strengths and weaknesses in project design or execution. And you want to strive for honest communication about what really worked and what needed greater attention or support in future projects. Discuss whether you envision a longer-term collaboration. Longevity grows out of strong working relationships. Follow-on funding, are there follow-on funding opportunities? We found that on our project. Can the project serve as a model, a pilot project to secure larger funding bids? And lastly, with regard to training and partnership, student placements, internships, are there opportunities to create permanent placements and internships, hiring on future projects? Several of the CCIs said that they would love to do that, but I often felt that there'd been a gap in communication with the universities. Again, with regard to student placements and internships, does your curriculum allow for proper training for student placements? Can these be seeded into curriculum development or design? I know, having been trained in folklore previously, that intercultural communication is really vital in this kind of collaborative work and in the partnerships that I would go on to work on. Next slide, please. So to give you a sense of some of the sources that I drew on for the framework, and for those of you interested in kind of pursuing additional research on your own, of course, we've got the deep dive interviews at the Digital Archive at Creative Manchester, and the reports that Sam Stockley-Patel and I co-authored. Several very strong secondary sources that we use, and many of these same reports that I drew on 20 other reports. So there's been a lot written about partnership, and it's worth exploring further. But as I'll note in my closing comment a bit later on, there is a definite gap in this kinds of skills and capacity building arena, which is why we're here today. Next slide, please. And lastly, just a brief nod of thanks to our colleagues at Aspect who funded the project, to our current and prior staff at Creative Manchester who worked on the project, and of course, XR Stories staff, John Swords, JT Welsh, and Sam Stockley-Patel. And at Cardiff now, Tim Edwards and Kostas. So that concludes the framework. You'll have an opportunity now. We're actually going to have you move into breakout groups. And we'll have a bit of Q&A later on, but we'd like to have you spend a bit of time for the next 20 minutes or so addressing two provocations that we've come up for you. Those will be in the chats. We do urge you not to spend time on intros, as tempting as that is, so that you can get down to business on those provocations. We'd love your feedback on the framework, and these two provocations are aimed to deliver that for us. So thanks again for listening, for being here today. So I thought we would go ahead and start by having the breakout room facilitators go ahead and report back. You know, feel free to use the chat mechanism, because that way we can also, you know, register the material, your comments long term. It enables us to get your report without hounding you down the road in a few weeks' time for it. But if you could also just talk through a couple of the key points and then go ahead and just drop those points into the chat, we'd be really grateful. John, can we start with you in the #1 breakout room? Is that okay?
Great, thanks, Alicia. Well, we had a really, really interesting session, and I'm going to begin by, I suppose, a couple of the main points that developed. One was thinking about efficient and sustainable relationships. And I guess one of the questions was raised that efficient maybe isn't quite strong enough, and that ethical is to think ethically and think about a code of practice, which would think about the inequalities between the research university partners and other partners who are either smaller organizations or are in the Southern Hemisphere, and looking at the possibility of an ethical partnership framework. And there were a couple of excellent examples from Glasgow. So Lisa has a hub framework which we can access, and Marcella has a sustainable futures network, which also has a good way of framing what an ethical partnership would require of everybody. We also talked a little bit about bringing in alumni, and also as bridge people, as sort of brokers between the other. It's in the chat. Thanks, Lisa, for the hub, and about using alumni who are working with companies who have an understanding of our timelines as well as the timelines of the places they're working as very useful bridges. And we talked a little bit about teaching-focused collaborations, which can bring organizations together as well as research organizations. And we also, I think, mentioned a few times the importance of transparency and of regular communication. And I suppose we all felt that what you and Kostas talked about in relation to grounding the relationship in common interests rather than just in a funding opportunity was really important to a relationship lasting beyond its immediate kind of priority. So I think that covered. Maybe Fidel, Lisa, Marcella, or Kate might have something else they'd like to add. The difficulty of university bureaucracy and the hostile environment for fractional contracts and RA work in partnership also came up as something which had worsened since the pandemic, and it's something that I think all of us in our institutions were aware of needing to put upfront in relationships. And I think my 2 minutes are well gone.
Thank you, John. Terrific. JT in room 2, if you could dive in.
Yes, so some similar kinds of things, but we had a really great conversation as well. And I feel like it was quite a practical one about different kinds of tips and strategies and things that people had found, or identification of challenges and things. So for the first provocation about sustaining effective partnerships, the big 3 things there were communication, being sensitive to needs, and really thinking about time. And with communication, I guess the big thing was about a mixture of formal and informal and different kinds of platforms and things. And, even talking about kind of just finding ways to become friends with your partners as well in different ways, and sharing different kinds of things, as well as having regular meetings at whatever interval is important. And that kind of goes with the being sensitive to different kinds of needs, sort of like what John was just talking about, recognizing that different partners have different resources. One thing that a few people suggested was about really keeping good notes or even spreadsheets about all the different people involved as your kind of cheat sheet of like where people are up to, so that you can remind yourself. And then with time as well, just the importance of like protecting time in your diary and thinking about the different ways that different people within an institution might measure their time and their workloads. And I guess one of the good suggestions there was having someone who can kind of be the person who nudges everyone or kind of reminds everyone or reorients everyone when you have those regular meetings. For the second provocation about the developing, implementing, evaluating frameworks, Just on frameworks generally, the kind of consensus was about the need for flexibility for, with different kinds of partners, different kinds of things, and avoiding them becoming too prescriptive, but that they can be really useful, especially for people new to partnerships. Getting resources right at the outset, making sure it's clear what everybody is bringing to the table, but also being ready for all kinds of weird things that might come up because of the nature of creative partnerships. We had lots of good examples of weird things, an 18-foot dragon and a 3D printed horse skull. And finally, just on reflecting and evaluation, sort of looping back to that point about communication, also keeping it informal and formal, having, these points certainly at the end of a big project where you formally kind of get together, but also just having key people get together regularly and kind of check in and see how things are going, because, different organizations, different partners, their resources will change, their staffing might change, they might grow, they might shrink in different ways, and just keeping that ongoing was a huge part of it, and having some kind of plan for doing that. Those are the big things.
Terrific. Thank you, JT. Tim, in breakout room 3, if you could give us a recap, please. And also facilitators, if you don't mind dropping in just some notes, however brief, in the chat, whilst we move on to the other rooms, we'd be really grateful.
So Alicia, I've just written up in very brief format in chat what we were talking to. I wasn't very disciplined as a as a chair, so I think we really just talked to the first question, and then it just kind of spiraled out of there. So in many ways, there isn't, I don't think, much more to add to what's been said. I think some of the headlines is around time and investing in time, and how do we support early career researchers around best using what resources they have. And some of that is about signposting within the organization or within the department or college, looking for small pots of money. That came up at the very end of our conversation. How do we support early career, mid-career researchers, and kind of plotting their way through? And I guess some institutions are better than others in achieving that. I think we spoke a little bit about a mismatch between funding timelines. I think this may have already been mentioned, and actually what you can do in the time that's expected. And that's a kind of difficult one to square with another point which was raised, which is it takes time to build these types of relationships, and they move from the informal to the formal, and they're kind of negotiated, aren't they? And their values are shared, and points of contention arise, and all these things take time to work through. And this is not an easy fix or a quick fix. And one wonders whether the funding arrangements and workload just are making it much harder for people to achieve that. And that's where I think good bureaucracy is important. We normally talk about bureaucracies being bad. I think really good professional services staff and an effective way of working is where we can really benefit. And I've certainly benefited it personally at Cardiff, and see the solutions in working in new ways with professional services to facilitate that and help that. Yeah, so I think that's it for me. I think I don't need to say anymore. Unless anybody else in the room from my room or the room I was in rather has anything else to add.
Okay, great. I think in the interest of time, we might jump on to Kostas with room 4. If you can give us a recap, please.
Yeah, Alicia. So in terms of the provocation number 1, I mean, first of all, I have to say there's some overlap between the points we discussed and what our previous facilitators presented. But in terms of provocation 1, how best can you sustain an effective partnership? A couple of points that became rather prominent was the amount of funding. Obviously, that helps. Amount of funding available for these types of initiatives. Also, another point that has been mentioned already, in terms of relationship building and everybody being on the same page, so the different collaborators, and also with that in mind, the importance of relationship building, trying to also come up with face-to-face meetings, regular meetings, etc., not just online meetings. Also, from the point of view, so perhaps that's the third point. From the point of view of an academic, our colleague from University of Bath kind of flagged up the issue of power relations. in terms of whether people may be intimidated or something. If if they're talking to somebody with who has a title of a doctor or something, so that would be like a benefit, but also a limitation in the sense that people may be intimidated, but also they may not want to talk to you if you seem to lack that credibility as an academic. For some people, actually, a doctorate is really important in order to talk to you or something, just putting it roughly. In terms of provocation number 2, so some of the challenges around implementing and evaluating a framework, developing, implementing, and evaluating a framework. So one of the points was that obviously you have to come up with something in terms of the framework that is sensitive to context. If you are partnering with different types of organizations, come up with something that captures and acknowledges the differences, in terms of the collaborators you have. Also, how could you possibly evaluate something which is new? I mean, that was a point from our colleague at the University of Oxford, working on partnerships, etc. So they have some new partnerships going on, and it's kind of it is a bit difficult to evaluate something that is about to take place. And also, they spoke about academics who actually have some experience in engagement, but others, other colleagues may be lacking that. But one of the challenges they're facing is coming up with a framework or a toolkit that could possibly be applicable across the board and be of benefit to both those with experience and those who are about to embark on partnerships. And finally, just a final point, sorry, because I'm running over, sorry. Is really a tension between, informally trying to build relationships with partners, but at the same time having to go through ethics approval, again, from the point of view of an academic, that often, as part of this ethics procedures, you have to outline everything, whilst you're also in a situation where you don't know exactly who you'll be talking to or who will actually be partnering with you in particular. So that was another point that was highlighted.
Great, super. Thank you, Kostas. Rachel and John, I think I'll just ask you to quickly just add something that hasn't yet been covered, but do give us your full little report, if you will, in the chat, but just so that we can stay to time. That would be brilliant. Thank you.
Sure. Sorry, bad time to get a frog in my throat. The key things that we talked about were having a single known points of contact on both sides to coordinate everything. That's not really neat. The time pressure on academic colleagues to do the early stage work to get useful partnerships going is a perpetual issue. Something that all universities need to be thinking about. How is this built in against the work allocation model, against other teaching and research commitments? And also, and one that's really a job for our team or our equivalents, if other universities have them, is listening to the needs and demands of our partners.
Super. Okay, great. John Swords, if you can add in what more was covered in your room, that would be brilliant.
Yeah, so a key one being the privilege involved in building these networks, having the time to do it, having a permanent contract so you can be located in the same place to build up relationships with different organizations, and how that becomes difficult, particularly if you're an ECR, without the experience, needing to try and navigate university bureaucracies, not being on a contract where you can invest time in relationships for fear of leaving things kind of untied up. So yeah, one thing we talked about that hasn't been covered elsewhere was the role of privilege in enabling this to happen.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Okay, good. In the interest of time, because I want to hand it over to Susie quite quickly, I'm not going to do a full summary, just hit a few points that I think maybe either weren't covered in the framework or have been reiterated across a number of the groups, and therefore worth mentioning. I think we've had sort of the communication trust issue as being vital on the sustaining of the partnership, the importance of working through conflict, the need to be speaking the same language and sort of a sense check as you work across the institutions. There was a brief mention coming out of room 4 about practitioners on both sides of the equation. And I think that that is an area for bridge building between someone who's both a practitioner and an academic. So I think looking to those folks as being potentially really strong partners on a university level. There was a lot of talk about funding, about tightening of resources, about contracts, and sort of the problematics. I think John Swords really pointed to that really well. We encountered some challenges on that on our own project. We are in a very tough time period. And I think getting at some of those questions about privilege and accessibility, I think is really part of the task. In terms of the challenges, I would say I feel as though time allotment has come up quite a lot, came up a lot in Rachel's session, her breakout room, the degree to which faculty need time allotted properly to undertake these projects. There was also discussion about, on the funding end, what you can actually accomplish in these limited funding time periods. I think that's very real and something that we all face. I think that in terms of maintaining sustainability, I think that comes back to, again, some of the power relations and some of the challenges between who's collaborating with whom across institutions. I'm going to close out actually with a quote on that to keep us on time again. That has to do with, where are those points of connection, and how sustainable then are those points of connection. But before doing that, I want to just reiterate this sort of listening to the needs of the partners. There was some talk, and we've presented this framework, but there was some talk about frameworks not being too prescriptive, about things not being too hardly, fastly set, and the importance of having that flexibility and the capacity to move through change over time on the project. I think that's vital. I think I'm having a slide brought up here quickly. So this is from an NCAS report, or NCASE report as it's called, that actually was quite useful as I put together our framework. While universities who are successful in knowledge exchange have a combination of partnerships together with a diversity of projects that foster individual and collaborative creative action, these tend to have relatively low degrees of strategic connectivity. Okay, this did come up in a number of these sessions, and are reliant on PIs as the linking node, making such networks vulnerable to changes in personnel. What this highlights on the HE side of things is a specific gap in skills and capacity building around the need for a strategic way of building greater reliance into the projects and partnerships themselves, essentially. Williams et al. Recommend an approach that focuses on investing in the development of more creative leaders. This is, I think, quite an interesting idea. More creative leaders, both within and outside the university space, across a range of career levels, and supporting institutions in learning from existing best practice, particularly around successful behaviors and networks. So I'd like to leave us with that. And go ahead and do a quick introduction of Susie, who's going to speak to us about collaborations from her arena. And Susie comes to us both as co-founder and director of the National Center for Academic and Cultural Exchange, or NCASE, and the Cultural Capital Exchange. Now, she joined TCCE's predecessor, the London Center for Arts and Cultural Exchange, as a member of the startup team in 2005. Between 2012 and 2016, she was also joint head of Knowledge Exchange Program for Creative Works London. She developed and project directed the exchange, co-funded by HEFCE, that's the Higher Education Funding Council for England, and Arts Council England, and was also a co-investigator of the Arts Council England flagship Boosting Resilience project. Currently chair of the board of directors of Jasmine Vardaman Company, which is an international dance theater company and a member of the Local Government Association Cultural Commission Advisory Group, Susie is experienced in brokering and leading arts and community research partnerships in a range of contexts, including placemaking, education, and performance. And her presentation today is titled Supporting Creative Collaborations, Key Insights from the Work of NCASE and TCCE in the Context of the Proposed Framework. Susie, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you very much. I'm just going to share my screen quickly, I hope. So there we go. Can everyone see that? Give me the thumbs up. Yes, great. Now this is going to be a little bit of a gallop. Alicia and Anne-Marie will be pleased that I'm just starting a stopwatch. But everything that I mention and all the research that I cite is all available free of charge on the NCASE website. And I'm also very happy to have these slides shared. So thank you so much for the conversation so far today and for inviting me to join you. I'm going to mainly talk about the work of NCASE and where I think the key intersections, synergies and points of collaboration with your framework are. But by way of background, thank you very much, Alicia, for that kind introduction. But just to say that I've been very privileged in my 15 years or so in this sort of slightly liminal, challenging and very interesting space of working between the creative and cultural sectors and higher education. I've been very privileged to work for projects and run initiatives that are devising mechanisms for bringing people together and funding small-scale collaborations as well. So through Creative Works London, which was one of the first AHRC knowledge exchange hubs, we were really privileged to be able to support around 109 collaborations. The exchange was a smaller project, the first project co-funded by HEFCI as it was back then, and the Arts Council, which brought together early career researchers and very small arts and cultural organisations to work together. And our real focus for that project was not just on the project outputs, but on developing and supporting good collaboration. And there is, even though I say it myself, quite an interesting evaluation of that project available on the TCCE website. And as a bit of a shameless plug, just because the issues around ECRs have come up several times, we do have a peer-to-peer development programme for ECRs who are looking to develop portfolio careers across academia and the cultural and creative sectors that has drawn on our work that we've been doing in this space since around 2016. So moving swiftly on, NCASE is the National Centre for Academic and Cultural Exchange. We're a relatively new project supported for 4 years by Research England, and our focus is really laser-like on evidencing and showcasing the impacts of knowledge exchange between the arts and cultural sector and higher education, with a particular interest in the cultural environmental impacts as well as economic impacts of these activities. And we have a very small core team, but also work with 4 hub partners: Bath Spa, Manchester Met, Birmingham City and Northumbria University. We've divided our work across 4 key work packages. So we do a lot of work around brokerage, collaboration support and networking, which again, feeds really firmly into your framework. We run what if conversations between the sectors. We're about to launch our own collaboration platform, which will be part of our NCASE Cultural Knowledge Exchange Festival, which will be the week of the 10th of October. We do a lot of work showcasing and talking about really great knowledge exchange projects and how they worked and how they work from both points of view. And we are also doing a lot of liaison with funders and policymakers around how this kind of work can be better supported. We do a lot of work around skills and capacity development for this kind of work. Alicia briefly quoted one of our reports. I'll talk about it a little more in a moment. We're doing a lot of work around creative leadership. We've just had our second creative leadership workshop in collaboration with CLAW. I think there are really interesting points around leadership in this area, not least that it's often not the people who are in traditional leadership positions within the academy that are often leading this kind of work. And we are looking at developing, I haven't decided on the title yet, a kind of creative leadership academy, but we won't call it that, because one of the things that people tell us is that the what they want is opportunities for peer-to-peer space and learning around leadership in this space. So we're doing quite a lot of work around that. We also run a network we call our Knowledge Impacts Network, which brings together people that are activating, strategizing, delivering and curating cultural knowledge exchange across both sectors together to, peer learn and look at how they can support each other to work in these spaces. Our last session focused on hacking knowledge exchange network, hacking knowledge exchange metrics, and how we might be able to help each other tell the story of cultural knowledge exchange better within existing frameworks. A really huge part of our work is around evidencing and impact development. We have launched our Impact Hub, where we have around 200 pieces of evidence around cultural knowledge exchange. So if you have reports that you think should be placed in our repository, please do send them through to us. We run an evidence cafe. We're trying to develop a community of writing and thinking and talking around evidence of cultural knowledge exchange in much more kind of creative and collegiate ways. And again, we run around 4 or 5 of those evidence cafes a year. So we would really warmly welcome you to join those, and furthermore to kind of propose ideas for focus of these discussions. The same with the Knowledge Impact Network. We want to hear from people who are delivering this work on the ground, and we're really happy to respond to your ideas and suggestions for content. And also within our evidence hub, we are publishing. We've published around 6 pieces of original research. I'm going to talk about a couple of them. There's more to come. In the next couple of weeks, we'll be publishing a series of in-depth case studies and interviews with knowledge exchange professionals. And also probably in the autumn now, the evaluation of the first set of very small collaborative projects, micro commissions we're calling them, that we've been able to fund ourselves. And a couple of those projects actually I think have real interest and implications for the framework. And I have sort of mentioned them to Alicia, and I will talk about them if there's time a little bit more. And then our final work packages around showcasing and communicating our work, but not just our work, all your work, the amazing, rich, varied and impactful knowledge exchange that happens with the arts and cultural sector around the country, showcasing, platforming and communicating that to the rest of the sectors, but also funders and policymakers. And for example, we just last week had a policy event around climate emergency and cultural knowledge exchange, which 300 people signed up to attend. So there is a real interest in work of this nature. Our work intersects with 4 key themes, all of which I'm sure will be really familiar to you working within the academy, but there are also themes that chime across the arts and cultural sector really strongly too. So I'm just going to talk really briefly about some research we actually did last year. Our literature review, which is available on our website, threw up, and this is not unexpected, that nearly all the writing around knowledge exchange out there comes from the perspective of the academy rather than from the arts and cultural sector. So we launched what we think is the first and possibly the only quite major survey to have the sector come back to us and tell us what they think about knowledge exchange with higher education. And none of it is that surprising, and there is some good news as well as some challenges. So around 80% of the respondents had been involved in collaboration with an HEI, which is great news. Not so great news, only around 20% of those had been involved in more than one collaboration with an HEI. There are various reasons from picking that. And as you would expect, a lot of that comes down to resource, but the will and the interest is certainly there. Arts and cultural partners reported themselves in a number of roles within collaboration, and interestingly, a significant number felt that they were leading or at least co-designing the collaborations, which is absolutely great and fits in very well with your framework. And interestingly, the second sort of most popular area of collaboration was working with students. And I know that this is something that's key to the framework as well. And actually one of the things that we see through our work in NCASE is that student knowledge exchange is playing a increasingly significant role within work of this nature. As I said, I'm just skipping through these, but this is all available in the report. So aspects that worked well, again, not huge amount of surprise there. And things that worked not so well, again, not so surprising. The word finance department came up on practically every questionnaire, which I know won't come as a huge shock to any of you. But really, one of the key barriers that comes through this and other work that we're doing is really a lack of understanding, not so much about the work that partners are doing, but the operating environments that they're working in. So funding environments, policy environments, perhaps misunderstanding around the realities of each other's operating environments. Language is a huge issue, of course, and money and time. And interestingly, the arts quoting lack of diversity within higher education teams as a challenge for them. And again, you know, looking at where the funding for this kind of work comes from, a lot of it comes from within the HEI sector, as you would expect. But again, you know, perhaps more than you would expect coming from the arts and cultural sector too, which is interesting. And although a lot of this work is pulling in very small amounts of funding, there is also a significant amount of projects that are quite high value, between 100,000 and £500,000, and certainly from the arts sector's point of view, that would count as high value. And again, just sort of barriers for collaboration. And again, you know, and we hear this time and time again, and I'm sure that you all do too, that the number one thing stopping the arts and cultural sector collaborating with the universities, in this survey anyway, was just not knowing how to go about it, who to contact at the university, who to talk to. The language around research interests and specialisms can be quite opaque. Finding the right person to talk to, you know, maybe you think you want someone in English literature, but actually you need a cultural geographer. But how would you ever go about, you know, knowing that, or finding those people, or understanding who to talk to? And as I said, you know, almost 3/4 of the people that we spoke to said that they wanted to work with higher education again. So the will is there. And I think with some adjustments as headlined through the framework, you know, we can make significant steps forward. And again, huge sort of intersection of interests in terms of what people are interested in collaborating around: placemaking, health and well-being, tech for social good, environment and climate crisis, all really on the arts and cultural sector's agenda to work around. One point I just want to make really quickly is that we haven't updated this research, but we've done some further research with the arts and cultural sector around their motivations for collaboration. And even over the course of a year, we can see that the motivations to collaborate are moving away from these kind of key themes and interests and towards, this is a dreadful time for us and we need to develop new sources of income and new business models. So I just wanted to note that here. Alicia's mentioned this research. I'm not going to talk about it in any detail because it's all up there and free and available. I'm just going to leave this slide up while I really quickly just share perhaps a couple of insights from my first read through of the framework. That I feel very privileged to have the opportunity to have an early sight of it. It's such a rich and thoughtful piece of work. Some of my initial thoughts were that it was fantastic to have seen so much thought given to capacity on both sides of the partnership, which is really great. But in my humble opinion, thinking and policy needs to go further if HEIs want to collaborate in sustainable and realistic ways with a wide range of arts and cultural organisations. It's fantastic to see acknowledgement of the time and expertise and hard work it takes to put the building blocks for partnership in place, and to observe that this work has to happen pre-funding. However, this is a sector made up of 97% SMEs, a majority of which are micro businesses. And once you get beyond the larger key regional organisations, the majority of staff will be on fractional contracts. There won't be someone available to lead on this kind of work. And this sort of pre-funding work you're asking people to do will need to be done as free labour on the whole. So even if you get to the funding proposal stage, the amount of time, effort and expertise required from your partners to engage in the process of preparing large grant applications is huge and can be really destabilising for small organisations. It's important, as I've said, not to underestimate the ongoing effects of the pandemic, cost of living crisis and Brexit on the sector, and the need for startup capacity building for relationship development needs to be funded. And I think this is particularly important if we're thinking about diversity and the diversity of range of partners that we work with, and how organisations can enact a wider range of inclusive and equitable partnerships. On a recent project in the Northeast, we heard from a range of global majority-led organisations that they were inundated with requests from HEIs to collaborate with them. There was a certain amount of healthy skepticism about the motivations for those approaches, but the main issue was that the capacity to engage, even with these requests for partnerships, was just not there. And this applies across intersections of class, gender and disability, as well as race. If we want equitable and diverse partnerships, pre-funding to funding is essential. And then following on from this theme of diversity, I just wanted to touch on leadership. It's referenced in the framework. And I think there's some great thinking around skills development and also acknowledgement of the inherent power balances that are present in this kind of work. However, again, I go a little bit further and say it's important for HEIs to front the idea that even if they are the academic experts, the intellectual leadership for a project may reside with your partners. This is particularly true where projects have social or community impact, for example, in the field of mental health, where you're working with people who embody lived expertise and daily experience. The flow of new knowledge and potential for sources of impact that the work of this nature brings into the university needs to be explicitly acknowledged and understood, and further partner organisations need to arm themselves with enough knowledge of the funding and policy environment to understand the value, and I do mean economic value here, of their contribution to their higher education partner. And just to finish, I know I'm 2 minutes over, but I'm just finishing. I think it's really important that we need to think about failure. I know we don't like using the F word, but collaboration is hard and projects often fail for a myriad of reasons. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, but we do need to let things fail well. So they need to fail quickly, and we need to learn from failure in order to build back better. So I know you've enshrined iteration in the framework, but I might go a step further and say we need to think about failure too. I'm going to finish.
Susie, that was fantastic. Thank you so much. And for making the time for a couple of comments, really useful comments about the framework itself. We won't have time for Q&A. There has been requests for copies of the slides. I'm sure we will be circulating those from Creative Manchester. But in the interest of time availability, we're going to go straight to John McAuliffe, who will make a few closing comments as Director of Creative Manchester. Thank you, John.
Thanks, everybody. It's a really, really fascinating session. I just want to say thank you to Susie for that. You know, I think you're going to be sending us all to the website, Susie, as well, just to be clocking all that good information, which tallies with a lot of, I think, what we were talking about. I'd also like to thank Alicia and Costas for their work ahead of today. Tim Edwards at Cardiff for his lead in taking this on there as well, to our colleagues in York, to Anne-Marie Nunez and the Creative Manchester team, and to Aspect for supporting this work. There are a lot of links in the chat there. Please use them. And to find out more about what we're doing as well, do follow Creative Manchester on social media, or sign up for our various updates on where we're going to be going next with this project as well. And look forward to, in the spirit of today's session, to being in touch with many of you in other, maybe more informal fora in future. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Terrific. I think we're at time. So we may have a closing slide, I think, that will have a bit of information if you want access to how to learn more about Creative Manchester's important work, do keep an eye out for future notifications related to our implementation workshop, which will take place at Cardiff, actually, in October, we hope. So thank you again for attending.